TUC Radio, San Francisco. Time of Useful Consciousness. Christopher Hitchens, The Trial of Henry Kissinger, Part 1. An overflow audience in a San Francisco bookstore was intrigued, shocked, and well entertained by Christopher Hitchens' eloquent indictment of former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. While the former Chilean dictator Pinochet finds himself under house arrest and war crimes by politicians in other parts of the world come to trial, Henry Kissinger, a major player in the coup in Chile, finally comes under scrutiny as well. He's said to now consult his lawyers before any foreign travel to make sure that he won't be placed under arrest for criminal actions he committed during the assassination of the Chilean General Schneider, the bombing of Laos and Cambodia, or the invasion of East Timor, to name just a few potentially prosecutable actions. The case against Henry Kissinger is laid down in Christopher Hitchens' most recent book, The Trial of Henry Kissinger. Hitchens is internationally known as an investigative journalist. He writes for The Nation, Vanity Fair, and Harper's. His books include Cyprus, From the Ottomans to Kissinger, The Case of the Parthenon Marbles, and The Missionary Position, Mother Teresa in Theory and Practice, and Unacknowledged Legislators. I'll invite you now to take part in the event as it unfolded. Michael Rosenthal, bookseller and co-founder of Modern Times, one of the important political bookstores in the San Francisco Bay Area, gave an inspired introduction to Christopher Hitchens. Here's Michael.
Thank you all for coming to Modern Times this evening. This is the largest crowd we've had here for at least 5 or 6 years. It's, of course, a great honor and pleasure and delight to have Christopher Hitchens with us. He is a matchless polemicist, a vibrantly witty writer, also terrifyingly erudite. Those of you who aren't familiar with that aspect of his work might care to look at this other new book, Unacknowledged Legislators, which is a collection of literary essays. But of course, that isn't the reason we're here tonight. And I don't think we would even have this many people here for Christopher Hitchens, despite his many sterling virtues and scintillating vices, without the topic of this book, The Trial of Henry Kissinger. Living as a radical in this country makes us all amateur experts in the problem of Job. You know, why do the evil prosper? Why is iniquity go unpunished? So the gratification of knowing that this man at least will not have the opportunity to die before he will have a good solid shot of knowing how history will remember him is deeply gratifying. That is Christopher Hitchens. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for coming out this evening. I was delighted to have a mention of unacknowledged legislation. Before Henry Kissinger was the magnificent mammal that we all know today, he was a member of a fairly well-known Washington East Coast tribe of third-rate, power-worshipping, pseudo-intellectual academics. In that capacity, he'd been grinding along. He'd written a couple of books, one on the problem of nuclear warfare, problem he identified as the way that nuclear weapons were tragically unusable. And he wrote another book. It's in praise of the short-lived, reactionary, myopic regime imposed upon Europe by Prince Metternich of Austria and the British Prime Minister Lord Castlereagh. And it's called A World Restored. And Kissinger says that Castlereagh and Metternich are the sort of politicians one needs more of. And Shelley and Byron and many others of what's now, I think, wrongly called the Romantic movement, it was a revolutionary, radical, very political, democratic movement, challenged the settlement of Prince Metternich, a settlement that excluded from Europe the Irish, the Poles, the Greeks, the Italians, the Jews, and many others. And Shelley wrote a poem which began, a pungent poem, said, I met murder on the way. He had a face like Castlereagh. Bear it in mind and think about this face, okay? I'll open it up for you. The question of face is quite important. When Henry Kissinger was asked by General de Gaulle why he was continuing to bomb what had been French Indochina in what was evidently a futile war of aggression and atrocity, he replied it was a matter of saving face. Have another look. Imagine, ask yourselves, how many human lives would you sacrifice to save that face? It's not a flippant question, because, as a matter of fact, rather a large number of people have been immolated for the sake of that face, and for the sake of the face of his boss and friend Richard and patron, Richard Nixon. And the subject of my book is exactly those human sacrifices, and how they were exacted, how they were lied about, and how they were justified, and how they still remain unpunished. And the best way to begin might be at the start, which is at the point at which Henry Kissinger made the transition from being a mediocre, time-serving academic to the one-man global rolling crime wave that has been his career ever since. Now, let me just ask you something. Have you ever heard the phrase peaceful, orderly, democratic transition of power? You have heard it. Have you heard it recently? I'm just trying to brush your patriotic G-spot, if I can find it. Okay, well, I see not in vain. One shouldn't have to keep on being told that there's a peaceful, orderly, democratic transition of power. If there really is a peaceful, orderly, democratic transition of power, it should go without saying, right? In 1968, there was a United States presidential election in progress, and there was also in progress the same war of atrocity and aggression in Vietnam. And by the mid-summer of 1968, it's fair to say, the majority of the American political establishment and probably a majority of the American people had concluded that at the very best, this war was a great mistake, and the shortest way out of it would be the best way. And even Lyndon Johnson and Hubert Humphrey had sponsored peace negotiations in Paris with all parties to the conflict, and that was the Democrats' re-election platform for that year, the peace plank. And Richard Nixon, with 3 other men, evolved the following plan. He decided that he would go to the South Vietnamese military junta, secretly, and by the way, illegally, and make them the following proposition. If you withdraw from these talks in Paris, if you sabotage them by withdrawal, and if you do so in a timely fashion on the eve of the election, and if the Republican Party wins as a result of the collapse of the Democrats' re-election program, you'll get a better deal from the incoming administration. You won't hear all this talk about negotiations with Hanoi and halts to the bombing process and all of that. We won't inflict that upon you. It had to be done very carefully because it was extremely unlawful. And it used to be that this was a hypothesis in Washington, a conjecture, a theory. Some people would say a conspiracy theory. But it's no longer correct to call it that. It's now established as a matter of record that that's what those men did. We know it because President Johnson had Nixon's campaign plane bugged and his campaign headquarters bugged, and he recorded the treasonous transactions. And just last year, my friend Anthony Summers was able to get the FBI transcripts, and I have them in the book for your reading pleasure. The people who did that were Richard Nixon, John Mitchell, later Attorney General, and Spiro Agnew, later Vice President. And there was a 4th man, Henry Kissinger. And the rest you know, because once Nixon was in power, he, having met Kissinger only once, personally, and not alone, to shake his hand and be introduced, immediately offered him the job of National Security Advisor. That was at their second meeting. And a problem at once presented itself. An illegal mortgage or lease has been taken out, secretly, for an extension of the war by 4 years, perhaps 5. And this lease has to be paid off. And paid off it was. Of the 57,000 or so names that are incised in stone on the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C., 21,000 of the names were added after 1968. We don't want to know, and I suspect daren't ask, how many Indochinese civilians and combatants lost their lives in the same period. There's no wall big enough to write the names on anyway. And the war had to be extended in order for the illusion that it could be won to be kept up. It had to be extended into two neutral, peaceful, non-combatant countries, Cambodia and Laos, and the supervision of that war, which was also fought and conducted in secret and without the knowledge of Congress, because it must be said for all of you, ladies and gentlemen, at least, your government thought enough of you to lie to you throughout this period. Take that as a compliment, if you will. I think you're entitled to. They did not think you would support what they were doing if you knew what it was. It's something. It's something to cling to. But it's not much when you think of the mass slaughter round the clock in Cambodia and Laos and Vietnam, and the loss of 21,000 illusioned young Americans, and the fact that the war is then ended very ignominiously indeed on terms less advantageous to all than were available in Paris in the fall of 1968. Let it sink in for a bit, because if you think of these two actions as one action, in other words, the deliberate sabotage of an American election, the undermining of an American election process by covert action, and the extension of an illegal imperialist war for 4 to 5 years, and the infliction of perhaps an additional, I would say, 2 to 2.5 million casualties, it, I think, constitutes the single wickedest act in American history. I don't think anyone will nominate a rival to it for that title. And note this too, of the 4 men who committed the crime, Richard Nixon managed to avoid impeachment. The first article of impeachment, by the way, was for the secret and illegal bombing of Cambodia. It's a great pity that trial never took place. But he managed to avoid impeachment by copying a plea, as you'll all remember. Spiro Agnew, Vice President Agnew, was indicted for other reasons and retired in all kinds of disgrace. John Mitchell, who with Henry Kissinger sat on the 40 Committee, the only Attorney General ever to sit on the body that oversees covert actions, of which Kissinger remained the chair, became the first Attorney General to go to jail. Actually, we got one, just for once, the slammer, behind bars, just for once, just one of them, for using the CIA and the FBI as a corrupt private political police to repress dissent and spread misinformation in the United States itself. So that's 3 out of 4. The lonely impunity of the 4th man strikes me even now as fantastically conspicuous, not to say nightmarish. The unindicted co-conspirator of the whole web of crime and aggression that starts in '68 and ends in Watergate. But on the subject of democratic, peaceful, orderly transitions of power, I have a number of others I'll mention. The first, and in a way the most noticeable one, was Chile. Now in Chile, one of our friendlier and more democratic and civilized neighbors to the south, the Chilean people took a real pride in the fact that alone in the southern cone of the Americas, they had peaceful, democratic, orderly transitions of power. You couldn't say the army was above politics in Chile. It wasn't. It was a very conservative army indeed, and it would intervene in things like labor disputes and so on between elections, but it very scrupulously abstained from picking governments. And the Chileans were very proud of this, and their neighbors in Argentina and Brazil and Uruguay and Paraguay and Ecuador and so on were rightly envious of them for it. And in 1970, there was an election in Chile, and it was won by Dr. Salvador Allende and the Unidad Popular, the Popular Unity Coalition. And Chile has a 60-day, I believe, but I might be open to correction, it may be a 90-day, at any rate, a minimum of a 60-day transition period. And in the course, between the election results being announced and being confirmed by the Supreme Court and the Parliament, in that period it was decided at a meeting in Washington that there wasn't going to be a democratic, peaceful, orderly transition of power in Chile, that the party and the president that had won the election were not going to be allowed to assume the seals of office, and that the army would substitute for that. But a problem presented itself at once. The head of the Chilean armed forces was General René Schneider, an honorable conservative officer with a constitutional cast of mind who thought it was his job to ensure that the officer corps in Chile kept its oath only to uphold the Constitution and was not seduced into the breaking of that oath. To every problem there is a solution. At the same meeting in Washington, it was decided that General Schneider should be murdered. The person convening the meeting was Henry Kissinger. I can show in this book do show in this book what lawyers in the Washington slang call a lay-down case. In other words, we have the minutes of the meeting where the scheme to murder Schneider was evolved, was concocted. We then have the discussions as to who is to be given the commission to execute this task, this hit. A group of extreme fascists, actually to give them their correct name, they were a bunch of men of proven records of extreme political violence who'd actually tried to overthrow the Chilean Christian democratic regime from the right a few years before. Fascists, in other words, were tasked with the job. Money was provided for them lavishly. We have the records of that now. Guns were sent to them through the American diplomatic pouch from Washington to the CIA station in Santiago. These men were told, keep it up. They made 1, 2, 3 attempts, failed. On the third attempt, with repeated injunctions to keep going, they killed General Schneider, shot him down in the street. They were then paid off again, a very large sum of money, paid after they'd committed the crime, and the evidence was destroyed and withheld from investigators in Washington, D.C. and in Santiago de Chile. It's a complete case. As of last October, when, thanks to Congressman Hitchens' amendment in Congress, we got the confirmation that the money had been paid after the hit, which means we don't need the C words any longer, collusion, complicity, collaboration, but the A words, accomplice, aiding and abetting, accessory. In other words, as guilty as if you pull the trigger yourself. And that was an individual murder committed by Henry Kissinger. That was, anyway, the curtain raiser for the complete abolition in Chile of the whole concept of the peaceful, orderly, democratic transition of power. And I won't have to weary many of you, I know, with what that led to 3 years later. And the murder not just of the leaders of the Chilean ruling party, elected ruling party, but the murder of democracy itself, the asphyxiation of democracy in Chile for nearly a generation. I've got some other transitions if you'd like. Would you like one more or two? Could you stand a couple more? Okay. Well, the people of East Timor, if they can get any feeling back in their limbs at all as they recover from what they've been through in the last years, will sometime, with luck, at the end of this year, have a peaceful, democratic, orderly transition of power and also to independence for their country. They were slated to have this election in 1975, when the Portuguese authorities gave up colonialism and announced as a UN trusteeship that they would supervise the transition of East Timor via an election to an independent state. It was decided by Henry Kissinger, sitting in the same room as the Indonesian General Staff, that that was not going to happen. There was to be no such transition, either to independence or to democracy. In the room with the generals, and President Ford also, he approved directly the Indonesian invasion of East Timor and the Indonesian attempt to extirpate the East Timorese people. And he made sure that the weapons of mass destruction required to conduct this operation were supplied to them. And again, I have all the minutes of the conversations, including a very damning one that he had at the State Department when he came back, because this involved a multiple breach of 3 sets of laws. First, by invading the territory of a neighboring state, which was in trusteeship to Portugal, a NATO ally, under the United Nations, Indonesia committed the grossest possible violation of international law. By deciding that East Timorese people were the obstacle to the consolidation of its design and setting itself to remove them physically from the scene, it violated the Genocide Convention. And this may seem trivial, but it also violated American law. The Foreign Assistance Act prohibits the use of American weapons for any purpose except external self-defense. And external self-defense does not consist of invading peaceful and defenseless neighbors who are in any case the responsibility of another country and the international community. In all these things, Henry Kissinger was completely, personally complicit throughout, and in particular in the sale of weapons, at a time when he knew, and the Indonesian Foreign Minister Adam Malik confirmed very early on in the process, that just in the invasion of East Timor itself, just in the original takeover, the Indonesian Foreign Minister thought probably not less than 150,000 people had been butchered. And that was before the news became evident of the use of food denial, starvation, defoliation, rape, and other weapons of indiscriminate genocide. At all these points, Henry Kissinger made sure that Congress was deceived and the flow of weapons by which this atrocity was carried out was maintained. And then leaving office, as he did a short while after that, was rewarded with a half share in a large gold mine in Indonesia and with a seat on a number of important corporate boards doing business in or originating in Jakarta, a role that he discharged until very recently, and in fact continues to discharge in the case of the Freeport-McMoran gold mine, which is one of the many sources of his income, because another offensive thing about this character is that his second career involves the franchising of the idea of dictatorship. He will advise people on how to keep their dictatorships going. He will advise corporations on how to do business with them. And he has made a gigantic profit out of the contacts and friends that he made during his time in office. But let's again just mark something. Pinochet, Suharto, Papadopoulos and Ioannidis, those are the dictators in the military regime of Greece. These men are all either in jail or they're going there in their own countries. All of Kissinger's partners internationally, and it's trite to say partners in crime, are all on their way to the joint. Not before time, but not Henry. Though it's my privilege to be able to say to you that under the Alien Tort Claims Act, a very noble, ancient piece of American legislation, now that we do have all the evidence about the direct complicity of Kissinger and other officials in the murder, kidnap, torture, and disappearance of named identifiable Chileans, there are Chileans who are able to sue for the deaths, the wrongful deaths of their brothers and husbands and fathers, and indeed in some cases their wives and mothers too. And they are going to sue. They are going to bring a civil suit, and they are going to sue Henry Kissinger. And I think it's about time. And you applaud, as you should, and it shows your comradely generosity, decency. But isn't that an absolute disgrace? Shouldn't everyone in this room be sick with shame that it's being left to the victims to volunteer, to scrape together the resources, to bring a suit in America when they've led lives completely maimed and tortured for 25 years and more, not even knowing where their loved ones were buried, that it's left to them to bring a civil prosecution? That is a national and cultural disgrace of a fantastically high order. And I want to make it as serious a point as I can. If there was one event that I would like to have been present at in the last few years, it would have been this. The British Special Branch, on a certain day, those lads were told, go round to where General Pinochet is, disconnect his phone, tell him he's under arrest, read him his rights, he's nicked. And they went round, and I'd love to have been there. Put under house arrest where he was only able to receive visits from Margaret Thatcher, which, if not exactly cruel, is certainly unusual, I'd say. Now, and this warrant executed on the order of, or on the request of a magistrate in Spain, remember, and taken to the House of Lords, which said that you may not any longer plead to charges of torture and murder and disappearance and kidnapping. You may no longer plead sovereign immunity. They struck down the defense of sovereign immunity. You may not, in other words, say, yes, I did kill these Chileans, but I was hoping to impress Richard Nixon. It just somehow won't work. It used to work. It used to work. I think that the right way to think about this is as the test case for the new international situation that has been created by the arrest of Pinochet and by the arrest of Slobodan Milosevic. We do, as a matter of fact, now live in a world where universal jurisdiction is being adopted by the courts of many countries. In other words, the war criminal is the common enemy of humanity, like the pirate or the kidnapper. He's to be arrested wherever he may be found and either tried there or repatriated to where he's wanted. That's universal jurisdiction. It's beginning to apply, and there are lots of people who are worried about it. The second is that sovereign immunity is gone as a defense. The third consideration is that the United States remains the most voluble moral tutor and lecturer to the rest of the world on the necessity for the speedy capture, trial, imprisonment and punishment of war criminals. This situation is too absurd to continue really any longer. And I don't believe it can continue. And even if it has to be left contemptibly enough to the efforts of Chilean volunteers and victims to bring it to a civil case in New York, it is inching closer. And as I was readying my book, I came across, I can't tell you how I came across it, but I stole a tape, and I've reprinted it for you, of Kissinger talking to his publisher. He could see a political crisis coming when it presented itself, and he's rattled. And he's taking advice from lawyers everywhere he travels now. And every time I think of that, I make a little holiday in my heart, and I invite you to join me. Thank you. Thank you.
That was Christopher Hitchens, writer for The Nation, Vanity Fair, and Harper's. His book, The Trial of Henry Kissinger, had just been released, and he had stopped over at Modern Times, an important political bookstore in San Francisco. This talk was followed by a very spirited question and answer session, and I want to invite you to tune in next week at the same time to hear about Kissinger's actions in Cyprus and Palestine, as well as more information on the legal instruments and congressional action that might actually bring Henry Kissinger to trial. You can get a copy of the full one-hour program with Christopher Hitchens that includes next week's lively question and answer session for $12. TUC Radio is listener-supported. Your tape order is welcome. It helps us continue our work. Our address is TUC Radio, Box 410009, San Francisco, California, 94141. That's Box 41009, San Francisco, California, 94141, USA. For a credit card order, call anytime toll-free 1-877-TUC-TAPE. That's 877-TUC-TAPE. Or go to our website at www.tucradio.org. That's tucradio.org. My name is Mariah Glarden. Thank you for listening. TUC Radio, San Francisco. Time of Useful Consciousness. Christopher Hitchens, The Trial of Henry Kissinger, Part 2. The Trial of Henry Kissinger is the title of the most recent book by the investigative journalist, author, and writer for The Nation, Harper's, and Vanity Fair, Christopher Hitchens. Last week we took you to Modern Times bookstore in San Francisco to hear Hitchens make the case that there are a number of criminal offenses committed by former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger for which he could go to jail. Only 2 years ago, that might have seemed an outlandish thought. However, Two recent events changed the perspective on this. One, of course, is the arrest of former Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet. Kissinger was deeply involved in the planning and execution of the coup in Chile, and at the minimum he might be requested to serve as a witness. Secondly, there's material now available that incriminates Kissinger. Minutes of meetings surfaced last year where, for example, the assassination of Chilean General Schneider was planned. They show how Schneider's murder was planned by a small group of 4 men, including Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger. Today you will hear the lively question and answer session. It includes additional information on Kissinger's role in Israel, Palestine, and Cyprus. You will also hear how an indictment of Henry Kissinger might be brought about. But first, we return to the beginning of it all, Kissinger's transition from an academic to Nixon's national security advisor, and his role in what may be called another stolen election. It was the year 1968. The war on Vietnam had finally captured global attention. The Democrats were trying to win on a peace platform. But that was the year Nixon was elected. Hitchens, in last week's program, told what happened.
In 1968, there was a United States presidential election in progress, and there was also in progress the same war of atrocity and aggression in Vietnam. And by the midsummer of 1968, it's fair to say, the majority of the American political establishment and probably a majority of the American people had concluded that at the very best, this war was a great mistake, and the shortest way out of it would be the best way. And even Lyndon Johnson and Hubert Humphrey had sponsored peace negotiations in Paris with all parties to the conflict, and that was the Democrats' re-election platform for that year, the peace plank. And Richard Nixon, with 3 other men, evolved the following plan. He decided that he would go to the South Vietnamese military junta, secretly, and by the way, illegally, and make them the following proposition. If you withdraw from these talks in Paris, if you sabotage them by withdrawal, and if you do so in a timely fashion on the eve of the election, and if the Republican Party wins as a result of the collapse of the Democrats' re-election program, you'll get a better deal from the incoming administration. You won't hear all this talk about negotiations with Hanoi and halts to the bombing process and all of that. We won't inflict that upon you. It had to be done very carefully because it was extremely unlawful. And it used to be that this was a hypothesis in Washington, a conjecture, a theory. Some people would say a conspiracy theory. But it's no longer correct to call it that. It's now established as a matter of record that that's what those men did. We know it because President Johnson had Nixon's campaign plane bugged and his campaign headquarters bugged, and he recorded the treasonous transactions. And just last year, my friend Anthony Summers was able to get the FBI transcripts, and I have them in the book for your reading pleasure. The people who did that were Richard Nixon, John Mitchell, later Attorney General, and Spiro Agnew, later Vice President. And there was a 4th man, Henry Kissinger.
That was Christopher Hitchens' account of the 1968 elections. Of course, in the question and answer period, the first question raised was, why did Johnson not make use of the secret tapes from Nixon's campaign plane? Here is Christopher Hitchens' response.
It's a good question, and the answer is this. It probably wasn't lawful to do that. Though it was not as unlawful as what the Nixon gang had done. It probably wasn't lawful for Johnson to have put bugs on the campaign plane of the person who was trying to replace his vice president in the Oval Office. And it's certainly, even if it could have been found a basis in law, because J. Edgar Hoover knew about it and had been cognizant of it, it would have been very embarrassing to have to admit it. That's the first thing. The second thing is, and it's in the memoirs, I've assembled all the different fragments of memoir that go to make up this story now. They now all fit together with the tapes. Clark Clifford, who was then Secretary of Defense, and others, all met, and they said, we can't let the Nixon people get away with this. If we must take it to the public. We must say this is a scandal, an outrage, a subversion, treason. Now, Hubert Humphrey didn't want to do that because Hubert Humphrey believed in bipartisanship. And what bipartisanship meant that year was, if the American people had any idea what was going on now, we already have a very unstable situation. There are riots in the ghettos, there are people burning their draft cards, there are soldiers shooting their officers in the back in Indochina. This would be a crisis of the system if we revealed what was going on here. So they had a private meeting with Nixon about it, but that's also what bipartisanship means, by the way. Mm-hmm. And they let it go. I think it was not the least of the crimes of the Johnson-Humphrey administration. It's interesting, it surfaces later in the Watergate period, when Nixon had been found bugging the Democrats. He threatened to go public, saying, this isn't the first time this kind of thing has happened. And he even urged Haldeman and some of his deputies, and I have their accounts of it, to make public the facts, but it was then pointed out to him he couldn't do that without revealing what he'd been doing when they were bugging him. At that point, he backed off. So it's one of those secrets that's known to everybody in Washington, but because it implicates the whole political class rather than any one party, it's not deemed fit to share with you, or me, or us. But I might add that one of the not very hidden agendas of this book is to, and especially in what I say about 68 and the later horror in Indochina, is to vindicate the memory of the anti-war movement, which is often written up these days with contempt or with hostility, very often with distortion, distortions that have quite rapidly become current in one's own lifetime, things one knows to be untrue. And I'm as hard as ice about this. We were right and they were wrong. The only regret anyone who was in that movement should have is for doing too little. If we had had any idea how much worse it was than we had suspected, we might have been able to generate the outrage and the hatred that would have been necessary to stop the war earlier than it was eventually stopped. And that's something I'm proud to say anywhere.
Do we know if Henry had his oar, was dipping his oar in matters of Palestine and Israel?
The question asks, do we know of any... It's a horrible metaphor, but he says dipping of Henry's oar into into Israeli-Palestine matters. Well, the reason why this book isn't quite a lot thicker than it is this is not a book about all the awful things you should know about Henry Kissinger. If it was that, it would be 5 times its size. I deliberately leave out Angola, Kurdistan, a number of other places, precisely because they don't bear on the new situation with international law. I only go after bits of him where he can be identified as criminal, not just morally criminal. But I can tell you a good Israel-Palestine Kissinger story, if you like, which would also educate you to detest and distrust your mass media more. Yes. My great profession. Would you like that? Well, this is a few years ago. It must have been, in fact, 84, because it was at the beginning of the Intifada, the massive civil resistance movement in the occupied territories in Gaza. That came as a tremendous surprise to most Americans, partly because nothing in their mass media could possibly have prepared them for the likelihood that a people living under a Pax Americana would risk death rather than carry on living under it. But be that as it may, it was a tremendous shock all round, and it met most people's definition of news, that this revolt was taking place against a Pax Americana situation. And there was a meeting in New York of senior members of the American Jewish community who were very disturbed and upset by this development. And they asked advice from various people, including Henry Kissinger, who came and gave them an off-the-record breakfast briefing in which he said that the crucial thing was to put down this rebellion with the utmost physical force and the least compunction in the shortest possible period of time, and that this would necessitate keeping the American press and mass media completely off the scene. The first thing to do would be to make sure that it couldn't be reported, because if it could be reported, what was needed to be done couldn't be done. Well, as soon as I read that, I knew who'd said it. Okay? And it was soon confirmed that he had said that. Typical, by the way, of his fantastic dreamland ruthlessness. I mean, a stupid plan as well as an evil one, if you follow me. but nasty enough for people at the meeting, to their credit, to leak it. And people said, oh, what a terrible thing for Henry Kissinger to say, and maybe we should wonder if there isn't the possibility of a political settlement with these Palestinian types, these chaps, who forced themselves on our attention. And I thought, well, that's all very interesting. What I want to know is Henry Kissinger still the consultant for ABC News, having made this recommendation? Made the recommendation that the American media be kept out of the scene altogether. So I rang Mr. Koppel, who had the decency to call me back, and I said, I have three questions for you. One, what is your comment on Henry Kissinger calling for the violent suppression of the rebellion in the occupied territories and the exclusion of ABC News, CNN, every other outlet from the scene? Second, how much do you pay him to be your news consultant? And third, is it true that he, Mr. Kissinger, once said that if he was again to be Secretary of State, he would ask you, Mr. Koppel, to be his Assistant Secretary for Europe? And Koppel said no comment on the first. Disappointing but not surprising. I'm not telling you on the second, that's the money. And yes to the third. Yes, I would consider it an honor to serve Henry Kissinger as Assistant Secretary. Well, there you have it. And that's the egghead show. That's what's meant by the ideology of objectivity, by the way. There's no bias in that presentation.
I'm interested in, on a couple different levels, what kind of response you've had so far.
Questioner asked what sort of response I've had, whether any of it's been unpleasant. I think that would cover it, wouldn't it? Well, the answer would be this. Try not to make it too long a story. I did send Kissinger a long email asking for an interview, and I didn't hear back. And then I was at that stage working on a version of this book for Harper's Magazine. So we thought, okay, well, we asked him. No one can say we didn't try. No reply. So then sent another email saying, this was actually my individual one. But I said, look, perhaps I should be the one to break the ice. I'm sorry I haven't heard back from you. I think I see a potential embarrassment here, and I should be the one to mention it. If it's a matter of money, because we know you like to charge for your opinions, we are prepared to offer you some. And we don't have very much, but could we say that if you would sit down for an hour and answer our questions on East Timor, on Chile, on Bangladesh, which I haven't had time to mention this evening, on Cyprus, we would pay you what Ted Koppel pays you for an average nightline, on condition that we could ask you the questions that he never asks. So I got back a really tear-stained letter that time from an underling called William Rogers, not the former Secretary of State, another one, Kissinger's former Undersecretary of State for Latin America, who is also a partner in Kissinger Associates and a partner in Arnold & Porter, one of the white shoe law firms in Washington, D.C. And I wasn't sure in which capacity he was replying, but he said it was the most disgraceful suggestion he'd ever heard. It was unbelievably outrageous, and he couldn't say enough about how his feelings were hurt and his whole trust in me had been completely spoiled. So I wrote back and said, I think you're the same William Rogers who appears in the minutes of the meeting between Henry Kissinger and Augusto Pinochet in Santiago de Chile in September 1976, where the threats were issued against Orlando Letelier, who was later blown up, and where a plan was made to circumvent the wishes of the US Congress in cutting off military aid to the dictatorship. But the minutes of that meeting show that you didn't say anything while that was being discussed. So I'm grateful now to know what it takes to arouse your sense of outrage. But then I'm sorry to say I said, F you, and so signed off Crystal Hitchens. And that was our last contact. We've had... The only other thing that's happened is that there's a very good website called Britannica.com, some of you may know it, which did a summary of my case against Kissinger and put it out for people to read, and then invited me to take part in an online chat on the Britannica website, which I was going to do one Thursday last month, I think, and it was cancelled an hour before it went out, and the website was torn down. And I know that the people who own Britannica.com are on the same board as Kissinger Associates, and I actually know someone who's on the board who told me that I was right to suspect what I suspected. But I thought, that's pretty pathetic. If this is the best they can do. And I can't say that Kissinger put them up to it. They may have done it as a favor to him. But I didn't think that was... when you think what people have been through in Chile or in Cyprus, it's really not much to put beside it.
Cyprus and the coup.
Yes. I'm always glad to have a question like this one, which asks me to say a bit about the island of Cyprus, which was actually the first place I came across Kissinger's footprints. Roughly speaking, I don't know how many of you know how much about it, but Cyprus is a small island. It's the third largest island in the Mediterranean after Sicily and Sardinia. It's an independent democratic republic, the far east of the Mediterranean, commanding the entrance to the Suez Canal and very close to Lebanon, Syria, Israel, Palestine. And the majority of its inhabitants are Greek-speaking. And in 1974, it was the only part of the Greek-speaking world that was not under military rule. The rest of Greece was under the rule of a military dictatorship of a fascist cast of mind, which was exactly the kind of relationship Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon thought it ought to have to the United States, which had helped impose it. It wanted to extend its rule to Cyprus, to try and annex this neighboring democracy. And the symbol of the democracy of Cyprus was the man who'd led it to independence, President Makarios, who was also the Archbishop of the Greek Orthodox congregation. Slightly too little separation of church and state for my taste, but not a bad guy and a Democrat, and elected. And very much the same order of business was followed as I've described in other events. People thought, well, if we want to get Cyprus under control, we don't want a neutralist, democratic, open society island that near to the oil fields of the Middle East and the Suez Canal. We have to bring it under control. Well, that would mean removing Makarios. Well, that would mean having him killed. These meetings all did occur, and the assassination attempt did take place, backed up by a military coup. All of it with the foreknowledge and approval of Henry Kissinger. The assassination attempt didn't work. There were people prepared to fight and defend Makarios, and they saved his life. But the coup did work. His government was destroyed, and it did lead to a disastrous war with Turkey and an invasion which has subsequently led to an occupation, a colonization, a mass expulsion, the importation of settlers, the imposing of partition, and the creation of a terrible regional arms race within NATO between Greece and Turkey, to which you won't be surprised to hear the United States busily sells arms to both sides. Given those odds, by the way, and that triangulation of forces, it's interesting to find that Kissinger, who in the second volume of his memoirs refused to discuss what he'd done in Cyprus, he wouldn't go near it. Lots of things don't appear in his memoirs, by the way. The name East Timor doesn't appear even in the index. The name Orlando Letelier doesn't appear in the index. But he says in his third volume, when he has to address the Cyprus question, that the proximate cause of all the problems in Cyprus was Archbishop Makarios. So he confirmed everything in his own leaden prose that one had ever suspected. No, the problem is not that there's a military dictatorship in Greece, that the Turkish army is poised to invade, that there are fascist gangs trying to conduct ethnic cleansing in both directions. And that's not the problem at all. The problem is the place has a democratically elected president. He's the proximate cause. Well, if he's the proximate cause, it can only be right to have him iced, can't it?
What's your explanation for the fact that those in the left, such as it is, have allowed him to flourish on the East Coast, teach a class at Columbia without any kind of protest?
I don't think he does teach a class at Columbia. He may have done. I know there was an attempt to appoint him to some honorific office at Columbia, but there was a big protest about that. He was made Chancellor of William and Mary University in Williamsburg the other day, whose first chancellor was George Washington. And I went down there to speak at what was actually a very big event, people protesting against it. The head of the Board of Regents at William and Mary is Lawrence Eagleburger, and who's a partner in Kissinger Associates and who brought to Kissinger Associates the business of Slobodan Milosevic. So I've actually been reasonably heartened at evenings like this and elsewhere at the fact that people still do remember what it is that is completely unpardonable about this person. What I do object to, though, is the Los Angeles Times running his feature his column as a neutral thing. And in the Washington Post, for example, which reprints it, it took an enormous campaign. We had to get congressmen involved, and lots of letters written to the editor of the Post to say, don't identify the author of this column as former Secretary of State. He's writing about China today. It should say that he's the chairman of China Ventures Incorporated, a wholly owned subsidiary of Kissinger Associates that franchises American corporations to Chinese Stalinists, and is the reason why Henry Kissinger, well, you couldn't put all this in but, something could be said about the conflict of interest. The same when he was writing about Mexico. He was then in the pocket of the Zedillo regime in Mexico. Quite a lot of them are going to jail, too, I'm pleased to see. It's a scandal. Actually, I could not say enough about the contempt I feel for my profession in this respect. They have completely abdicated the role of journalism in the minutest details and become really, well, it's lapdog, not watchdog, shall we say.
What are the tribunals and the world courts where Americans like Kissinger can be tried?
The lady wants to know what's the situation with international tribunals and their jurisdiction, not just for wrongful death matters, but for war crimes, and whether or not there's any precedent of an American being hauled before one. No. And there won't be one in The Hague either, because The Hague, the new International Criminal Court, quite correctly doesn't have retrospective, or do I mean retroactive, jurisdiction. In other words, it can't consider any matter before it was set up, which, well, means anything before last year for practical purposes. There is an inter-American court, which hasn't met much lately, but wasn't able to meet while most of its member states were dictatorships. There is a court, a forum in the Americas before which an American could be asked to appear. There are prosecutors in Chile in the Pinochet case who want to extend the prosecution to include Henry Kissinger and the people who invented Pinochet, and who want to extradite him and or subpoena him. And the United States would then be in a very ticklish position of having to say, well, we're not going to give up any of our people to your trial, right? And that would be embarrassing. That could happen too. Incidentally, for a corollary, I'm wandering a bit from your point, but I'm afraid the basic answer is no, not yet. For a corollary, a few weeks after Pinochet threatened Orlando Letelier, a well-known Chilean exile and dissident living in Washington, D.C., threatened him twice at a meeting with Henry Kissinger, of which I have the transcript. A few weeks after those threats were made, Orlando Letelier's car was blown up in rush hour traffic in downtown Washington, D.C., a few hundred yards actually from where I live, and he and his American friend and comrade and at that moment driver, Ronnie Moffett, were killed, were blown to pieces. Now, it's actually still illegal to let off car bombs in downtown Washington, D.C. at a rush hour time, or actually any other time. And it's illegal to do it even if you don't kill an American citizen. It's taken a very, very long time to establish the chain of command that led to that bomb going off, but it is now as much of a lay-down case in the opposite direction as Kissinger's orders to have Rene Schneider murdered are in the preceding case. So the Justice Department Criminal Division now has the job of finding a reason not to issue an indictment of Augusto Pinochet. They have all the evidence now in their possession. If they do not do it, it would, in my opinion, constitute grounds for the impeachment of the Attorney General, John Ashcroft, if he doesn't do it. And something to write to your congressman about. Write to your congressman righteously and say, excuse me, is it the case that we are not going to proceed against a foreign dictator who lets off car bombs on American soil? I'd like to see them get out of that. The second question would be, how has it taken so long to establish this fairly elementary chain of command? Because there was a lot of obstruction of justice, wasn't there? And destruction of evidence, and intimidation of witnesses in Washington, D.C. And I can point you to one or two people, one in particular, who's implicated in that too. So I think that what we're looking at actually is microcosmic revenges for macrocosmic crimes. I'm afraid that's the way the law very often does proceed, as it did with Pinochet. But it expands all right. You can take heart from that. And it should. And I believe, I really do believe will. But it's going to take a much wider awareness of it and a lot more publicity before that happens.
the U.S. ever prosecuted any of its own highest level officials?
The questioner asks, has the U.S. government ever prosecuted a high-level official for war crimes? The answer is no, that it has not, but that General Telford Taylor, who was the senior United States military prosecutor at Nuremberg, went on to write a book called Nuremberg in Vietnam, comparing the standards and the evidence and asking the question, had the U.S. military policy in Indochina crossed that line? And he answered it pretty much in the affirmative. And he wrote that book, by the way, before the bombing of Cambodia was undertaken or disclosed. And he pointed out that the United States had at Nuremberg sworn to be judged by the same standards that it was imposing in that court. It caused those standards to be written into the founding documents of the United Nations, of which it remains the senior member as well as the host country, in many ways the founding member, so that the basis for such a judgment does in fact exist. It's a matter of what's sometimes called political will.
That was a question and answer period with Christopher Hitchens, recorded at a book release party for his most recent book, The Trial of Henry Kissinger. Hitchens is a writer for The Nation, Vanity Fair, and Harper's. You can get a copy of the full 1-hour program with Christopher Hitchens that includes last week's talk at Modern Times Bookstore for $12. TUC Radio is listener supported. Your tape order is welcome. It helps us continue our work. Our address is TUC Radio, Box 410009, San Francisco, California, 94141. That's Box 410009, San Francisco, California, 94141, USA. For a credit card order, call anytime toll-free 1-877-TUC-TAPE. That's 877-TUC-TAPE. Or go to our website at www.tucradio.org. That's tucradio.org. My name is Mariah Glarden. Thank you for listening.